New regulations introduced by the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority mean that now more than ever, grain growers need to be conscious of reducing and managing spray drift. Principal Scientist for Agricultural Chemicals at APVMA Dr David Loschke discusses the changes, beginning with labelling of 2,4-D and MCPA products.
Every product that has enough of a risk that requires some sort of protective no spray zone or buffer zone will have a number of statements. It'll have a required droplet size that people must use. We'll have a prohibition against any spraying during inversion conditions. We'll have a requirement for record keeping, and which hasn't always been, which is not uniform across the various states, but now for these products it'll be required of everyone. And then for the immediately below those restraints will be the buffer zones themselves, and what those will be cases where the particular issue of concern is identified, and then a distance, a specific distance that must be allowed to remain between where spraying quits and this particular area or object of concern downwind from where spraying.
With an increase in a buffer zone, some growers will be thinking this is going to reduce the amount of land that they can actually farm. How do you answer those concerns?
The buffer zones are only downwind buffer zones. So, and some people have told me that, oh, the wind always blows in the same direction where I live, and it never stops, and so forth. We know from years and years of very detailed Bureau of Meteorology data all around Australia and all the cropping areas that simply is not the case. That there's very predictable patterns to that, and while it might be difficult in 1 or 2 days' time to find the right window, it nearly always or virtually always happens that the wind is going to shift direction for enough time for a person to go down and spray, say, a particular end of the field that they couldn't spray the day before or 2 days before. That's one point. And the other is that the buffer zones that we are putting on labels are based on risk assessments using current, conventional, and typical technology and practices that are used throughout Australian agriculture. But what we want everyone to know is that a lot of the practices that are being used are old-fashioned and out of date, and some are simply wrong-headed. And what we are hoping to do is to get more people aware of the new options, not all of which are expensive. Some of the times we're talking about nothing more than a new set of nozzles, many of the time. Others sometimes newer types of equipment or just different kinds of practices can solve the problem.
You did say that some of the practices are wrong-headed. What would be an example of that?
You always wanted to put on a fine droplet spray. And there was no questioning that was necessary in virtually all cases, because the idea is you had to get uniform coverage. Now there are some products where that is necessary, it's true. But for many of them, it didn't need to be as fine as they were doing. And for many, it doesn't need to be fine at all. We've found now, and we had evidence for a long while, but now we have abundant evidence that 2,4-D, for example, all of those systemic herbicides like that, except in quite rare, a few unusual herbicides, but virtually all of them do extremely well with, well, they do perfectly well with coarse, the so-called coarse droplet spectrum, and even very coarse and even extremely coarse, which are standard droplet spectrum that people in the industry, they know what that means. What we will do as an authority is we will require every chemical manufacturer who registers a product with us to nominate what is the largest droplet size category for which their product will still be effective, fully effective. And then that's the one we will use, we'll put on the label and require people to use at least that size droplet category. And then we will do our risk assessment on the basis of that. So and this is why, this is the motivation for a chemical company to be honest about it.
Up to 750 metres has to be left as the buffer zone if you're spraying next to remnant vegetation or another crop. Is there any way that growers can work to try and reduce these buffer zone sizes?
Oh yes, we've been working really hard to develop what amounts to an entirely new approach or program that we're going to put on our website in the next month or two, and what we'll give it a name, something like drift reducing technology. It'll be a section on our website, and what it will do is allow, or rather act as a reward for people who take up better practices and better technologies.
Of course, you'll need to wait for the research to be done, but when we talk about a reduction of the buffer zone, are we talking about a serious reduction in size?
Aerial buffer zones can be up to 800 meters at times, and it could mean cutting it in half. Sometimes even less, depending upon the particular kind of technology we're talking about. Ground applications, their buffer zones have a maximum of about 300 meters, but that they nonetheless could also see very, very significant drops, in particular dropbacks to that, maybe again as much as half if they were willing to use some of the newer approaches. Is
there a time frame for the introduction of this review, or is it all happening now?
What we'll do is run the review, go through the entire process, and then new products will appear. That same product will appear with new labels, and it's only when the new label is there or has been declared to be there that the grower is obliged to follow it. So for all those other products that we haven't had the time yet or resources to go out and review, their time will come, but for now it's a matter of, again, as always, reading the label, reading the current label. That's the proper lawful label for the product.